Good evening and welcome. My name is Mike Fargione. I'm the manager of field research and outdoor programs at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. If you're not familiar with Cary Institute, we are an independent ecological research and educational organization. We're in southeastern New York State, and our scientists study forests and freshwaters, urban ecosystems, and the ecology of diseases. And they work here in New York as well as around the world. This evening is the final session in our 3 weekly forest stewardship workshops. Tonight we will, as they say, get down to the nuts and bolts to talk about hands-on aspects of planning and implementing forest stewardship. Each of our previous sessions were recorded and are available on our websites, and we'll do the same thing with tonight's presentations as well. You'll get a link to them in a couple of days. This workshop series is a collaborative project with Julie Hart of the Dutchess Land Conservancy, and as I've said in the past, it's a pleasure to work with Julie. We'll be hearing from her shortly. Normally, we do this as an all-day event in person with indoor conversations and then walks in the forest to view the forest and compare different habitats and sites. We hope we can get back to that in the future. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a chat feature, and we'd love to have you share with us who you are and where you're located, and if you want, a brief comment about your interest in forest stewardship. And once we start, we will be turning off the chat function, and then as we move through tonight's program, you can type questions as they arise into the Q&A feature. That's also on the lower bar. So we'll have plenty of time at the end of the program to answer questions. And with that, I'm going to start my presentation and tonight's program. Okay, we're at session 3, planning and implementing forest stewardship. We're excited to be with you tonight for this final session. Our goal for this series was really to provide a different kind of spin, an ecological emphasis, and to help people understand forests maybe in a different way. By doing so, we wanted people to consider the ecological consequences of their management actions and help them feel empowered on their stewardship journey. In our first session a couple weeks ago, we addressed the forest ecology and history of the forests here in the Northeast. We reviewed what forests do for us. We talked about ecosystem services and how to think about space and time on scales that are relevant to forests. We reviewed how climate and plant dispersal mechanisms impacted our forests in their development since glaciers receded. We talked about how plant species changed over time and how plants alter their own environment by changing how much light reaches the forest floor. We talked about how light levels changing permit different plants to dominate over time, and how this succession of plants through time brings with it changes in the organisms as well, the invertebrates and the vertebrates that adapt to a particular plant community. And we discussed how the last 300 years of human land uses have led to today's forests. They're not what was here before the European colonization. They continue to change even now, and they will be different communities if they look at them in the future. During our second session, we focused on threats to forest. We discussed development, fragmentation, and habitat loss. We talked about how human-caused disturbances can degrade or destroy natural communities. We spoke about invasive plants and pests and pathogens, and how our area is ground zero for many of these invasions. And we mentioned Tree Smart Trade program that's educating people how they can prevent new invasions before they take place. We looked at how browsing by too many deer resulted in the loss of plant diversity and wildlife habitat, and how deer browsing is causing widespread failure of forest regeneration. And we spoke about predictions that the interactions between human land uses and invasive plants and too many deer may be acting as a barrier to northward tree migration as trees try to adapt to climate change. We also introduced one more possible threat to forests, and that was the threat that we, as stewards, will shy away from trying to actively manage our lands. The threat that we don't manage is real. Some folks may be frustrated that they don't have the means or the times to accomplish all the goals they'd like to. Some are unsure what to do. It is complicated, and they don't want to make a mistake. So they may decide it's best to just let nature dictate what happens without interference from people. But there are a number of reasons it makes sense to actively manage our forests. Today's forests are not pristine communities. They're not transitioning towards some pre-colonial natural condition. They reflect centuries of human disturbance. The disturbances we see today are not equivalent to what made those early forests. At least here in the Northeast, we've reduced disturbances like wide-scale fires and beaver flooding, and we've introduced many new pests, pathogens, and invasive plants. Change is happening in our forests. It will continue to take place if we act or not. And we should ask ourselves, do we like the direction that those changes are headed? Many forests are moving towards simpler communities that are less able to support other wildlife and to withstand catastrophic disturbances. So really, we should recognize that letting nature take its course is a management decision, and it may not always be the best choice if we hope to leave things better than we found them. So if you've tuned in to any of our previous workshops, you may look at this slide and say, oh no, not another Leopold quote. But as it seems so often to be true, his quotes express the essence of what we hope to convey much better than I can. And so Aldo Leopold said that the act of creation are ordinarily reserved for gods and poets, but humbler folk may circumvent this restriction if they know how. To plant a pine, for example, one need be neither god nor poet. One need only to own a good shovel. And that's what tonight is about. We're not playing God, but we're talking about commonplace things we can do on our journey to be good forest stewards. This evening, we'll be talking about identifying your interests and setting goals with consideration of ecological principles. We'll talk about why it's okay and even advisable to seek help from others, the importance of making a plan, easy ways to assess your forest health and the risks your forest is facing. We'll talk about knowing where you're starting. In other words, the tools to inventory your forests as they exist now. Julie will be taking us through that discussion. And to make us all feel like we've spent some time outside, which we all sorely miss, we're going to finish up with a virtual forest walk and give you some basic examples of how one might assess forest health. So let's get started. What are your interests and goals? Do you desire to enhance scenic beauty of your forests, or to preserve wildlife habitat or a water resource? Is privacy important to you? Are you concerned about protecting nature or biological diversity? Do you want more hunting or wildlife viewing opportunities? Or have you an interest in increasing the amount of firewood or timber you can produce off your land? Are you interested in non-timber forest products, things like maple syrup or growing mushrooms? Do you want to increase or protect carbon sequestration? Your interests and goals will direct the path of your stewardship activities. How about your spouse or your partner's goals, your kids' goals? It's worth having the conversation with all of them, especially if you expect them to spend weekends pulling invasive plants or cutting firewood with you. When you're setting goals, be sure to include all the players. There will be differences in opinion, I'm sure, but you'll have more success if you can work through and come to compromises with everybody. Getting everybody on board will make life a lot simpler. And remember to scale your project to both you and your team's interests and your abilities. Don't be afraid to seek help from professionals. For many, it's not just their job, it's also their calling. There are federal and state agencies, there are universities, particularly the land grant universities, that have very useful resources, both personal and written materials that are available to us. There are many private organizations like Dutchess Land Conservancy, Cary Institute, the Nature Conservancy, Scenic Hudson, Hudsonia, just to name a few, that have great expertise. Don't forget about professional consultants and volunteer programs like the Master Foresters Program or the New York Forest Owners Association. Don't be afraid to look for help or bounce ideas off other people in the field. They may have heard of something new and exciting that'll help benefit you in your efforts. Sometimes financial assistance can actually be available to help with stewardship projects. For example, the New York State 480A forest tax law encourages the long-term management of woodlands to produce forest crops. But your plan for the 480A program can be tailored to include ecological benefits as well. The NRCS, or National Resource Conservation Service, often has monies dedicated from the Farm Bill that can be directed towards aspects of stewardship. Regenerate New York is a brand new cost-sharing grants program that was just announced by the DEC. It can provide funds for stewardship activities like tree planting, invasive plant control, and deer fencing. So there may be funds available to help you along your way with your stewardship activities. Look into them. Don't be afraid to look to reputable sources online for resources about forest stewardship. For example, the Woods in Your Backyard workbook is a favorite, and it's well worth adding to your library. It not only gives background information, but examples and worksheets that you can adapt to your own site. Another great resource, the My Woodlot organization. They focus particularly on the New York City watershed, but their resources have value beyond that region. So look into them as well. You have to know what you currently have to be able to plan what's feasible to do down the road. You won't know what's there if you don't look and sample appropriately. So inventorying your forest may mean developing some new skills like tree ID, learning how to use some new equipment, measuring, and God forbid, even math. But don't panic, there's lots of resources available out there to help you. And Julie's going to be focusing on this and taking us through some examples in the second presentation this evening. Another important part of your homework is to consider constraints that might limit your success and what risks may come along with your site and your plans. There are constraints and risks that are economic and physical. There are social constraints, such as what kinds of activities may not be looked upon favorably by your neighbors. There are legal constraints, covenants and easements and right-of-ways that limit what you can do with parts of your property. Regulations, zoning laws, all of these can be important constraints that you need to look into before you start. There are ecological risks and ecological constraints as well. The Keep Forests Healthy flyer from the Nature Conservancy is a great tool to begin to look at forest health and ecological risks. It covers things like forest diversity and species composition, the structure of your forest, its age, diversity, how much dead and down wood is there space for new trees, is there competition? It talks about regeneration and the abundance of desirable and undesirable plants, Are they suitable to our growing area? What about deer pressure? It talks about things that are site risk, soil quality, excess or lack of water, susceptibility to weather, and the impacts of climate change. So this is a pamphlet that's well worth getting a copy of and looking at in relation to your forest. An even simpler method of evaluating forest health is the Healthy Forest Checklist that's available from mywoodlot.com. And we'll be going through this as an example in our videos later tonight. It's worth the effort to put your ideas down on paper. Creating a written management plan may be required for some government programs you want to be involved in, but they can also help to focus and guide you on your journey throughout the course of your stewardship activities. Management plans should contain several sections. They should include what are your interests and what are your goals? What's your resource inventory, or what's there on your forest right now? It should assess the potential constraints and risks and describe suitable best management practices. It's great to have a work schedule and a monitoring plan so you know those features of what you're going to be doing in the future. Management practices should be based on your goals, the current conditions, the constraints, and the costs. They have to be site-specific. A practice that is useful for one species may not be useful for that same species on a different site. Always look for best management practices, or BMPs. They tell you the best method of dealing with your particular activity. Don't be afraid to consult or even hire a professional. It can pay off in the long run. And again, investigate cost-sharing opportunities like we talked about earlier. Consider who's going to do the work. Are you capable of doing it? Should you hire it out? What will it cost? Can you afford to do it now? Or perhaps do you need to wait until you profit from some other activity and put it off till then? Be realistic, but be careful when you compromise so that you make sure that you're not compromising your goals. Again, consult with a professional. It can more than pay for itself by preventing mistakes that can cost you time, energy, and effectiveness. When you're implementing your plan, try to constantly clarify unknowns and unforeseen things that happen. You'll gain knowledge and judgment through this experience, and you'll learn from it and learn things that you can use to your advantage in the future. Don't be afraid to track your progress. Keep notes, keep a journal. Written and photographic records of your activities and your progress can be invaluable in the years to come. Be prepared to reevaluate your goals and their feasibility. Remember, it doesn't matter really what the cost has been so far, it's the costs that remain that really matter. Pace yourself. It will be a lot more pleasant if you enjoy the process. The journey matters as well as the end result. I'm going to finish my presentation with a short example of a personal forest stewardship journey. And I'm sharing this not to give you a path that you should expect to follow or copy, or because I think we're doing everything right. We've made many mistakes and more are coming, I'm sure. But perhaps it's an example that if we can take steps to be better stewards, if I can take steps to be a better steward, then probably anybody can do it. So here's our example. We have about 12 acres. It's primarily forested land. It's surrounded by a town road on one side and a major parkway on the other. In addition, we have several right-of-ways that run through the property. There's a small wetland and a seasonal stream. Here's a view from the DEC Environmental Resource Mapping Program. It shows the couple of wetlands and the small stream that's seasonal, and I've drawn in where the right-of-ways are to show other areas that are potentially limited in what we can do. Here are a couple of aerial photos. The one on the left was taken in 1940 of the property, and the one on the right in 1980. The photo on the left may explain in part why there's not a lot of diversity of wildlife or plants on the property. At least through the 40s, this land was mostly cleared and used for pasture or hay, or with small areas being under cultivation. It was actively farmed for many years, but sometime after 1940, farming ceased. And the 1980 photo shows that by that time, most of the property was covered with young forest. Today, the property is dominated with two major forest communities. On the upland sites you see here in yellow are the oak and hickory ridges, and those are the most dominant species in the canopy. In the lowland sites, there's ash and elm, big-tooth aspen, and red maple, and they dominate the canopy. The left photo was taken in 2016, and the right photo in 2020. If you look closely at the two, you may see a significant change that took place in this forest over that very short 4-year period. Here's a close-up in 2020. Starting around 2018, we began seeing signs of emerald ash borer symptoms on the ash trees. And by 2020, more than 100 mature ash had died. So you can see the white skeletons of the dead ashes at the various arrows in this photograph. Many, many trees. Here's a couple of views of how the forest looked after EAB finished killing off the trees. Lots of dead trunks, lots of open canopy space, particularly in the lowlands areas. A related observation we made at the time was that the areas where ash dominated the canopy were also areas where invasive plants were the most common, and particularly bush honeysuckles, burning bush, multiflora rose, and oriental bittersweet were very common in these areas. In the 2 short years where the ash began to die, we could see an impending dominance by these invasive plants. They were preventing sunlight from reaching the forest floor, and the other native tree species that were down there were struggling to get enough light. It was clear that these species of invasives were going to prevent regeneration in these openings caused by the emerald ash borer. So the ash death and the proliferation of invasive plants was the straw that broke the camel's back and made us decide we needed to make a plan and take some action. So we developed a simple management plan, and we did things we thought we could accomplish. We talked about our interests and our goals of scenic beauties, of abating some of the noise coming from the highway, reducing the number of ticks around the house. We wanted to enhance our biodiversity in the forest and reduce the dominance of invasive plants. We wanted to improve wildlife habitat and enhance our ability to view wildlife. Our resource inventory was the result of 17 years of living on the site, and we relied extensively on online resources to figure out what to do. We assessed the potential, the constraints, and the risks. Not all the stands were heavily invaded or dominated by ash. The wetlands and the streams provided resources and diversity of habitats, but they also were areas where we'd be limited in the kinds of management actions we could take. The right-of-ways were also areas where we couldn't do much. We had a limited access to heavy equipment. We had limited financial and person power ability, but we realized to do nothing would result in the dominance of invasive species and the loss of diversity on the property. So we came up with our best management practices. For invasives, we were going to do cut stump treatments and mowing and pulling in the elevated areas. In the wet areas, we'd be forced to deal with just non-chemical means. In terms of planting new species, we'd favor natives based on which ones would meet the site's water requirements or tolerance. We try to increase the diversity of plants. And we decided to plant conifers where we could hopefully increase the sound barriers to block the highway noise. We knew we'd have to thin some of the native plants, so we'd favor natives over introduced, we'd favor rare over abundant, and we try to retain wildlife food and cover species wherever possible. With all those dead trees down there, we had to make a plan for what to do with the dead ash. So we'd fell the dead trees where they posed a real danger, but we'd leave them standing for wildlife and let them fall on their own where they could do so without danger. What about work schedules? We do things as time allowed. We both have full-time jobs, but we'd focus first on the areas where the ash were dead, particularly around the house, and we'd move to other areas in the future. And then we made a monitoring plan. We're on site daily, so we're looking daily at what's happening and how our efforts are taking shape. We made a decision to look seasonally to try and evaluate our efforts and look to plan for the next year, whether it's ordering trees, equipment we need to buy, or perhaps hiring people to help with projects we can't do on our own. So there's no high tech here. We've got an old Gravely mower, a chainsaw, and some hand tools, and that'll have to do for now. We're focusing on invasive plants, particularly Asian bittersweet and multiflora rose, because they're the ones that are really choking out a lot of the native vegetation. The lowland areas were the first areas we tackled this spring. So we began clearing invasive plants, and in some cases, some of the native spice bush, which was dominant. This photo on the left shows a before picture, and the photo on the right shows the area within one of those areas that the ash died that's now ready for planting to trees. We put out markers so we could find the seedlings after we planted them and continue to remove invasives around them. And we piled up the brush outside the planting areas to create cover for wildlife. We're continuing to clarify the unknowns and the unforeseens to gain knowledge and judgment, and to try and learn from what we've done and to use that knowledge. And one of the pleasant surprises is that not all the unforeseens have been bad things. For example, we've spotted new plants. This spring, we saw a bobcat hunting just outside the yard, and we made the light bulb moment when we realized that we could buy a tree for Christmas with roots on it and then plant it. And this year, we were able to do that on January 2nd. We've been tracking our progress, keeping notes, a journal, and written and photographic records of our activities, and we'll be reevaluating our goals and the feasibility each year as we get older. We're going to pace ourselves and try and enjoy the process, and remember that the journey is as important as the end. So that's my story. Hopefully that's an example you can say, hey, if he can do it, I can do it. And up next, Julie's going to be talking to us about tools and techniques for learning about your forest. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? Oops. Thank you so much for sharing that case study. I think that is a really valuable thing to share because I know a lot of landowners are dealing with that exact problem right now. So as a staff member at Dutchess Land Conservancy, I travel around to a lot of different properties throughout Dutchess County, and one of the things I've been seeing pretty much everywhere is dead and dying ash trees. So I think your situation is something that is shared by probably a large number of the people who are tuned in tonight, and hopefully they can take some good pointers from you in your experience. So tonight, we're covering our inventory and planning section of our forest stewardship webinar. My name is Julie Hart, and I'm the Senior Manager of Stewardship and Education at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. I'm an ecologist, and a big part of my job is to work with landowners who have protected their land with conservation easements and help them kind of work towards, better stewardship of their lands. And I find people are endlessly interested in the different techniques and just learning about their land, the plants and animals that share the land with them. So I'm really glad to be here with you all tonight. And what I'm going to cover is some of the mapping and identification resources that you can use to kind of investigate your land and explore it, learn a little bit more about what's there. Now, there are a lot of methods for actually sampling your property, setting up quadrants and taking measurements. We're not really going to cover those tonight because that's the sort of thing that we would rather be in person to do that. But there are a lot of resources, and Mike mentioned a number of them, that have a great deal of information and opportunities for you to learn how to explore those types of measurement techniques. The woods in your backyard, mywoodlot.com, and others like that have a lot of resources that you would be able to use. So what I'm going to cover is the sort of computerized aspect of nature exploration. Some of the great online resources that we have that you can look at to look at maps of your property and see what you have in terms of natural resources on your property, which gives you a sense of the ecological communities that are present and how you can work to be a good steward of those communities. And of course, because it is the 21st century, there's apps for that. So we'll cover a few of the apps that you can use, load onto your phone that you can use to identify things on your property. So I hope that most people on the call tonight are from Dutchess County. This is something that is kind of exclusive to Dutchess County. Many counties do have various mapping utilities. I'm going to be slightly biased here and just say that ours is really, really excellent. So if you are a Dutchess County resident, there's tons of information on our county website. One of my very favorite tools is the Parcel Access utility. So Mike and I are putting together a list of the resources, the websites that we've mentioned during these webinars, and we'll provide that to you along with the recordings of tonight's presentation and the other two presentations. And so don't feel like you have to scribble down all of these websites. We'll provide that to you later. So if you go to the Parcel Access website on the Dutchess County Real Properties Tax Service Agency website, this is what you'll see first. So first, find this parcel mapping tab and click on that, and then you get this screen. Next, click on this screen right here to launch the Parcel Access Map. And what you get is a map of the whole county. So this is what the home screen looks like. You can see we have up-to-date aerial photos of the entire county, and I'll walk you through the toolbar and the search box in a moment. So this is the whole county. You can zoom in on any area. And so I zoomed in on the area where Mike and I did the video that we're going to show you in a few minutes. So this is the Cary Institute property. You might be familiar with it. You can see the intersection of Route 44 and Route 82. And so the Cary property kind of runs left to right across the screen and includes a great deal of what you're seeing here. So you can zoom in on the land that you're looking for. I just happen to know where this is, so I could zoom in easily. But if you're looking for a particular parcel, if you look in the top right corner, you can see that search box where you can enter in a parcel number or an owner's name or an address, and you can also find a parcel that way. So a couple different ways to find the parcel you're looking for. So here is the toolbar. This is in the top left corner of that home screen. And there's a lot of different tools that you can use. I'm going to focus on a few of them. So one thing that I always like to look at is flood areas and wetlands. So that gives you a sense of what type of land and habitats and ecosystems you might be dealing with. So for example, remember on Mike's property, you could see that he had areas that were more upland and areas that were more lowland and wet with a stream and some wetlands. So if you click on those boxes, you will get those resources to come up. So here again is the Cary property, and this shows just the wetlands. So the blue lines are the state designated wetlands designated by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And the green is federally designated wetlands. So that's done through the National Wetland Inventory by the Department of the Interior. And you can see there's a lot of overlap in them, but the federal wetlands include smaller wetlands as well. So state wetlands tend not to include anything smaller than 12.4 acres. And the federal mapping program has different criteria. And so they're also mapping a lot of these much smaller wetlands. So those are the kinds of things you might find tucked away in the woods in the back of your property. And you can also see that stream corridors are also mapped as wetlands on this. So this will show you any wetlands that are on your property or in your area. And keep in mind the essential component of connectivity of wetlands. You can see how these streams and wetland complexes are connected. And so if you have a part of a wetland on your property, anything that you do with your stream or your wetland is going to impact your neighbors as well. And there are regulations and laws regarding what you can do in these state and federal wetlands. So should you have one of these on your property and have questions about management, I would refer you to the Dutchess County Soil and Water Conservation District for advice on that. So this is showing the wetlands, and this is the floodplains. You can see that kind of blue shading in the background. So you can see the wetland complex that runs through the Cary Institute from north to south is a very, very large wetland complex that also includes a great deal of floodplain. And this is all connected through the east branch of the Wappinger Creek is running through there. So you can use parcel access to look at the wetlands and floodplains that you have on your land. And another interesting thing that you can do is switch from that aerial based map to the terrain map. So this shows you the different elevations. You can see how it's shaded in such a way as to show you the topography. And this makes it really clear why that large wetland complex is there. It's very flat land. So there's a lot of room for the water to spread out, which is what is making those floodplains. And so this is just another way of looking at your land to see those topographical features. So you can always switch to the terrain map on parcel access. Now, to find out more information about any given parcel, there's an identify button in the top corner. So I've clicked on that to activate the identify feature, and then I've clicked on the parcel. This is the area where Mike and I will be exploring during the video that's coming up. And you can see on the right side of your screen, you get a lot of information that comes up about the parcel, who owns it, the address of the parcel, what school district it's in, and all sorts of useful information about that. If it's your parcel, you probably already know all of that already. So let me just focus on some of the interesting things which are found at the bottom of that column, which are the historical resource link. And so this links you to a historical resource survey that was performed in 1986, covered the whole county. And if you click on that link when you've identified a parcel, it takes you to the historical resource survey for that area. And you can see these are scans of hand-drawn maps. This was the 1980s, remember, so they didn't have iPads back then. And no GPS either. So hand drawn on a map, these are all scanned, and you can see, for instance, down in the bottom left corner, you can see a little blue circle with an eye in it. So that means there's a point of information there that you can click on to learn more about. When you click on one of those, you might get something like this, a scanned PDF of, it's often a building, a historical structure that was identified during the survey. And you might find information about when it was built, what types of materials it was made out of, usages over time. So there's a great deal of information in the historical survey. Not every parcel has a little dot on it that indicates something that was mapped during the survey, but it is really fascinating to click around on this map and see the work that was done during that survey. Now, the other thing that you'll find in the bottom right when you click on a parcel ID is a link to aerial access. And this takes you to the county website called Aerial Access, which is a series of historical aerial photographs. Now, I have to warn you, this is highly addictive. You can get lost in these. They're on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see all the different aerial photographs that are available. This is for the whole county. It goes all the way back to 1936. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, those are the dates that the photographs were flown. And the letters indicate the type of aerial it is. So TC means total color. CIR means color infrared, which means that any green vegetation is going to show up in red. So that can give you a lot of information as to the more vegetated areas of the landscape. And then at the bottom, all the black and white photos, everything 99 and prior to that was done in black and white. So this, what you're seeing on the screen right now, is the 1936 aerial photo of that same area of the Cary Institute property. And you can see it's quite different now. There's some areas that were open fields back then and still are. You can see that the wetland stream complex is there as well. But you can also see some areas that are forests now had been fields back then. You can even see a lot of lines on there that probably indicate stone walls. And interesting point in the kind of lower right side, you can see that large oval. And if you're not aware, that area of what's now the Troop K state police headquarters, and points north of there was the county fairgrounds at one point long ago. And that is a remnant of the county fairgrounds. That's the old track. So it's endlessly fascinating to page through these photos, look at these areas as they've changed over time. So this, as I said, is the 1936 aerial. So when you're in Parcel Access and you click on that link from the parcel, it takes you directly to that location. But you can also go to the Aerial Access website and just start at the county level and zoom in to whatever looks interesting to you and choose one of those photos. The website seems to be under construction right now. When I grabbed this screenshot, it did say that it was experiencing some difficulties. So they're in the process of updating it. It does look different now than it did last year. So stand by for future updates, I would say, and keep checking back. Now, the next website that I want to run you through is the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. This is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has put this together. And this is the home page for it. So you'll click to enter the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper. It brings you to this screen where you just have to click on OK. And then it takes you to the mapper itself. Now, when you do that, you'll be able to use the plus and minus to zoom in and out on the map. And the little box with the arrow at the top just moves the map to full screen. So you get to see more of the map at a time. So you can click on those. And I have zoomed in here to the Cary Institute property again. On the left side is all the legends and layers that are available. And this website is also being constantly updated. It's a great deal different now than it was last year at this time. They've added a number of new layers. So you can see the different tabs for the Hudson River estuary layers, streams and watersheds, wetlands, forests, biodiversity, scenic and recreation layers, and reference layers. So it's a lot to explore, and I'm only going to show you the very basics tonight because you could spend hours in here. So you can zoom into your location. And if you're zoomed in far enough, you can pull up the tax parcels. So you can see, again, we have the tax parcels of this area of the Cary Institute. You can see I've checked the box in the lower left corner for tax parcels. And it's worth mentioning, so you don't get too frustrated, that a lot of the layers available on this resource mapper are zoom sensitive. And so you may have to zoom in or out depending on the layer to make it visible. So if you look on the left side, you can see we've got 3 main layers available under wetlands: state regulated freshwater wetlands, wetland soils, and national wetlands inventory. And you can see that the legend for wetland soils and national wetland inventory is in italics. What that means is that I'm zoomed too far out. Those layers won't appear until I zoom in a little bit closer. The scale is just too large. So I can zoom in closer and those layers become visible. And I've turned on the National Wetland Inventory. You can see it's the same information that we saw on Parcel Access. It just has a little bit more information. It's color coded as to the specific type of freshwater wetland in the National Wetlands Inventory. So remember, Parcel Access has them all as just a uniform green color. In the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, you can actually see which type of wetland is which. So that can be really helpful. Now, I'll just run you through a couple other interesting things on the resource mapper. The forest layers, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, has an enormous amount of information. Within the past year, they've added this forest condition index. So this gives you a lot of information as to not just the presence of the forest, but the quality of it. So there's a lot of information available as to how they made that determination. But you can see basically that the purple, blue, and green forests, as they're color coded, are the higher ranking in terms of forest condition. So again, they're using a lot of variables: the size of the forest, the connectedness of the forest, the amount of fragmentation in a forest patch. And so all of those variables go through a complex computer model and end up with this percentile ranking. So that's some really useful information to look closer at your forest. And to learn more about what all of these colors mean, every layer in this utility has a little eye after it. And if you click on one of those eyes, it takes you to the metadata, and that tells you what that means. What is that layer? So at the top, you can see this is the Hudson Valley Forest Condition Index. There's a brief description of what that data is, where the source data from which it was generated, and what it means basically. And should you have GIS capability, there's even a link for the GIS data download at gis.ny.gov, and another link to the New York Natural Heritage Program that talks about the forest patch data that contributed to this data. So click on those little eyes if you have any questions about the layer that you're looking at, and there's an enormous amount of information available. And a lot of these data layers are available for download. So if you have GIS capability, you can actually download those layers and use them yourself. A couple other interesting things, the biodiversity layers. Again, this is something that they're adding to constantly. And you can see this area, this is the same area of the Cary Institute property, that we have some important areas for migratory fish, which is the east branch of the Wappingers Creek. You can see there's important areas for rare terrestrial animals. Now, this data doesn't include specific species names. That's not usually public information, but it gives you a sense of where those species can be found, and if your property is part of a large patch or corridor that is used by various rare species of plants and animals. Now, that's the online mapping utilities that you can use to look at your land. If you want to actually get outdoors and start identifying things, there's some great resources that you can have on your phone. So iNaturalist.org is a way to record your observations, and those observations are shared and vetted by other naturalists who can confirm species identifications. And this is a great resource for crowdfunded or crowdsourced projects like citizen science projects where, you know, maybe a public preserve is having a bio blitz and you're able to participate through iNaturalist. So that's a really wonderful thing to have on your phone for exploring the outdoors. And you can be a part of a larger data collection network when you do that. Now, there's a couple simpler ones. These are just kind of the point and shoot your camera and it'll tell you what it is. Two of my favorites, Seek by iNaturalist. So this is kind of a simpler version of iNaturalist that is a pretty straightforward identification tool. And LeafSnap is another one that is pretty popular and has a lot of identification capabilities. So I'm not going to walk you through how to use these because I'm sure that you can figure it out. So those are a couple of apps that we can use to identify the trees and plants and animals on our properties. I would also point you towards the USDA's Web Soil Survey, which is, I'm not going to lie, a pretty complicated utility. You might not be able to figure this one out. There's a lot in there. But if you go to the USDA's website, click on this little green button here, and it takes you to the home screen. You can zoom into your area, and it allows you to designate what's called an area of interest. So I've done that for this Cary Institute property. Then I click on soil map and it brings up this map telling me exactly which soil types are where. So again, tons of information to dig into, and I don't have enough hours in the day to explain why I think soils are important. But let me just remind you that the land is composed of layers. We covered this in another session. And if you know the soil type, it tells you a great deal about the property. So for example, a Wayland silt loam is a wetland soil. Nassau Cardigan Complex is more of an upland soil. So when I know that that's the soil type there, it tells me the general topography of that particular area. It tells me what type of habitat might exist there. And because I know that, I can make some guesses as to what type of vegetation is likely to grow there. And because I know the vegetation types, I would be able to speculate on the types of animals and wildlife that you would be able to find in that area. So it's all layers, and it really comes down to soil type. Everything is built on that. So because there's so much complexity in our landscape, and, you know, as Mike covered very, very well, the long-term consequences of management decisions are pretty profound. Improvisation is a bad idea. So Mike gave you some really, really great pointers on formulating a plan and how to carry it out. I'm just going to leave you with some words of wisdom from some great thinkers. First of all, my shop teacher from middle school who had these posters up on his wall. This is a shop teacher who's teaching middle school students how to use like a bandsaw and a welding iron. So very safety conscious. And he encouraged us to think. Whoa, remember to think your way through things. Don't be spur of the moment. double and triple check everything. Put your Thinking caps on, he would always tell us. And the other wonderful poster that I think says pretty much everything you need to know is to remind you to plan ahead. Remember, as Mike said, make your plans. Don't do things on the spur of the moment. And sit down and make your plan and figure out a timeline for it. Don't just launch out and get started on it. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of Aldo Leopold quotes, because of course I'm wrapping up with some Aldo Leopold quotes. So this is a pretty lengthy one, but it's very, very thought-provoking. I want you to think through this. He says, the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like, but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And lastly, I'll give you the quote that when someone asks me about land management and what should they do, this is the guidance that will always steer you in the right direction when you're making management decisions. Remember what Leopold tells us. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And so that's what we've been trying to help you with, is to learn how to, identify what you have so you can understand the biotic community that you're a part of, and that so you can identify how to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of that biotic community. And so I will finish up there and stop sharing. And Mike, if you want to go ahead and start the video, I think we're all set.
Very good. So you can hear me, Julie?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we love to be in the field with people and take them out on walks and show them the forest and talk about forest stewardship and ecological principles. And unfortunately, we've been unable to do that, but we're going to take you out in the forest anyway. And let me start off by saying, if there are any professional actors or videographers in the audience, we apologize at the beginning.
We had some microphone issues. We're not sure what happened.
Yeah, there were other issues too, but let's go ahead.
Hey, Mike, your video's not playing.
It's not coming up.
It's not working. Okay, let's try it again. Hang on.
Okay, now we can see it.
All right, here we go.
So one of the things that it's worthwhile to do when evaluating your forest is to look for signs of disease or damage in the trees there.
Well, let's take a look around. This is a great time of year to be looking at this, because as the trees are leafing out, that gives you a sense of which ones are alive, the ones that have leaves on them, obviously. So in general, this does look like a pretty healthy forest. I see a lot of greenery. The canopy looks pretty full and healthy. Not a lot of signs of disease in the canopy, but we can see off to the side here, we do have a number of American beech trees that have clearly been infected with beech bark disease. So they have that kind of gnarly, cankered bark that indicates that they're afflicted with that and may die of it at some point in the future. What else do you see?
Over here on one of these small saplings, we can see where a deer has rubbed its antlers, removing some of the bark, and that tree probably won't survive. It's limited to one tree. So overall, I think you're right. This really does look like quite a healthy forest. Next, we should be looking at what kinds of species of trees we have here, and what about their ages? Is this a uniform stand of one species, all of the same age, or is it a lot of diverse species of diverse ages? As we look around, we can see big trees and medium-sized trees and even small saplings and seedlings on the forest floor. So it looks like we have a diversity of tree ages.
Yeah.
What about the species you see here, Julie?
There's quite a variety of them. So even if you're not that great at tree identification, you can look at the bark. Usually gives you an indication of the different species. Bark, of course, changes quite a bit over the course of a tree's life. But you can see the different textures and shadings of bark tell me that there are quite a lot of trees here. So I see some red oaks and some white oak and quite a few beech trees. What about all this stuff in the understory?
In the understory, we've got some young trees of those species you just mentioned, but we've also got hop hornbeam, and I see some serviceberry.
So tree identification is kind of a lifelong pursuit. You can know a lot, but there's nobody who really knows everything about it. Trees are like people. Each one's an individual, and they change as they grow. So we have a lot of tools to help us identify trees. There's all kinds of field guides, dichotomous keys that you can get. But since this is the 21st century, I'm going to show you how to use an app. So there's this great app. It's called Seek by iNaturalist. And it's really simple. You just load it on your phone, and then you point your camera at whatever you're trying to identify, and it will go through, you know, as closely as possible, kingdom, phylum, class, order, all the way down to genus and species, if you can get a good enough picture of it. It's not that great with tree bark. It can get some tree bark identification okay, but that's a little trickier. So I use it mostly when I can get access to leaves, which mostly means seedlings and saplings because tree leaves are too far up in the air. So I've got this on my phone, and I got this little seedling right here. Let's see if we can figure out what this is. So I'm just going to point my camera at it, and it's thinking. It knows it's an oak, but it's not confident enough to tell me what species. Now I know that this is a red oak, but you can see these leaves are not fully expanded yet. They're really tiny. So on this one, I think genus is the best we're going to get. But let's go see if we can try this on some other seedling. All right, what is this? It's got leaves that look a lot like maple leaves at the 3 lobes kind of structure. This is a maple leaf viburnum. That's really interesting because that's not a tree at all. So that comes up on the phone, and if I click on view species, it'll tell me all about it. It's a native. It shows me the range map and the seasonality of it. So when you can identify a species, it'll give you more information about it. So this is an understory shrub species, as it turns out, not a tree at all. But you can see why they call it the maple leaf viburnum, because those little leaves look a lot like maple leaves. So here's a whole bunch of seedlings that all look really similar. They have these kind of elongated leaves with the rounded lobes on them. Let's see if we can figure out what that is. So you have to adjust the camera a little bit, go at a couple different angles to see if it'll pick it up. Okay, it knows it's an oak tree. Let's see if we can get the species. Chestnut oak. So chestnut oak also has this deeply ridged bark, and I can see that there's several of them around us on the hill. So that must be why there's so many of these seedlings. There's quite a lot of trees here that drop the acorns that these all grew up from. Yeah, there are a lot of different age classes in here, which is great to see. This is actually something that you might not see in all the forests of Dutchess County. Because remember we talked about how the deer browse the understory so severely that there's not a lot of regeneration of the tree species. And so what you end up with is a forest that's full of grown-up, mature trees, but no seedlings and saplings. It's like a town without any children. It's like all, you know, not all old people, but all mature people, and no young ones that can come in and grow up and take over when the older trees become diseased and died, as you know they will at the end of their lifespan. So that's something else to look for in terms of the age classes of trees that are present, not just the diameters of the trunks, but also the vertical stage that they are at and how much understory vegetation there is.
So it's great to see that we have some seedlings here that are going to be the next generation if some disturbance takes place and takes out the larger trees. So that's another sign of a healthy forest. In our healthy forest checklist, one of the things it talks about is lichens on trees. And if we look at different of the larger trees in this forest, we can actually see there are quite a few lichens growing on the trees. That probably means these trees are not suffering from a lot of pollution.
And there's a lot of misconceptions about lichens. I think because they do look kind of scabby in their growth form, so people tend to assume that they're a negative sign. But actually lichens are a very positive sign of forest health. They're indicators of good air quality, and they don't harm the trees at all. So lichens are a good indication to find in your forest.
One of the things we're going to be looking at as we evaluate this site is the amount of organisms that are living here besides the trees. And so one of the areas that holds a tremendous amount of life that we don't often think about are the soils on the site and the area where the soils meet the leaf litter and the fallen logs. And so if we were to look closely through here, I bet we would find there's a lot of different organisms both in the soil and at the soil surface level that are helping to be the foundation for the whole food chain in this forest community. What about standing trees and dead logs? What do you see in here, Julie?
Well, there's definitely some downed woody debris. So we've got all the way from tree trunks to small branches and kind of scattered throughout. Not a huge concentration of them, but a good amount. And so as Mike said, those are great habitat for things that are decomposing them. So there's an incredible amount of a food web going on in that kind of material. And that is basically going to decompose kind of back into the soil, which is where it came from in the first place, into those nutrients and carbon that'll become part of the soil and taken up by the next generation of trees.
The next thing we're probably going to be looking for is other species of wildlife, the larger organisms that move across the landscape. And we're not seeing anything right here, right now, but we can see signs of them. And so if we look in different places along the forest floor, we can see where wild turkeys have scratched up the leaves.
Yeah.
We can see places where the deer have left droppings. Just a minute ago, we were hearing a red-tailed hawk calling. So we think we probably are pretty close to a hawk's nest, and maybe upsetting them a little bit.
Sorry, hawk.
Yeah. So we're seeing lots of sign of large vertebrates here. Early in the morning, you'll hear lots of birds in this area. So we think it's probably habitat that's used by a lot of neotropical migrating songbirds as well. Right now we're not hearing much, but it's the middle of the day, so they're kind of silent and doing other things. There's also lots of wildlife that are hidden. They're hiding under the leaves, they're hiding under these fallen logs, and if we were to look around, I think we would probably find red Fs, other salamanders perhaps, and lots of insects.
So much life in a forest is actually small. You need to sort of crawl around on your hands and knees with the magnifying glass to find, the insects and those small salamanders and all of that kind of biodiversity that's the base of the food web.
So this is how you might go through your forest and do a very brief and easy kind of summary checklist of how healthy is the site. You certainly can get into more depth than this, looking and evaluating all of these aspects in a higher level. But the basic first step is great to just go through and see, what do I see here? And do I feel like this is a healthy forest? And maybe what does it need to be more healthy? Here's a good example of some of the impacts that deer can have on our forests. This is a young chestnut oak seedling. We can see on this side where there's a nice new growth of a bunch of leaves that have broken this spring and started to be formed. But on this side, there's not much there. And that's because deer have been in here during the winter and have fed on these young shoots. And each of these shoots has been picked off by a deer as it browsed its way along. Deer have no teeth on the upper part of their mouths in the front, and so when they bite and tear. And so what we can see here is a torn piece of the stem, and that tells us this was deer and not some other organism. Too many deer means not enough seedlings for the next generation of forest. So that's certainly something you want to be paying attention to when you're looking at your forest. Are you seeing signs of excessive amounts of deer damage? Well, here we are, Julie, in a different stand. It looks a lot different to me. What do you think?
It looks a lot different. There's a lot going on here. Where do we even start?
Well, what about signs of disease or damage from our Healthy Forest checklist?
Yes, and yes, in that order. There's a lot of disease. You can see some trees that have died from emerald ash borer. There's quite a number of those around.
Right here.
Another one. And the damage, here's a tree that's been tipped up probably in a windstorm that has fallen over. So there's quite a lot more wood on the ground here. Probably some of these trees that are emerald ash borer have been shedding their branches. So there's quite a lot of wood on the ground and quite a lot of disease.
So we've got a disturbance that's both natural from the fallen logs as well as man-induced by the introduction of a pest, emerald ash borer. And the result is an opening in the canopy, a gap.
Yeah.
And what's happening as a result of that gap is we're getting a proliferation of small plants on the forest floor. And not all of them are particularly happy to see here. So I see a lot of things like bush honeysuckles,
barberry. What else is here? There's some
that looks like olive over there.
Burning bush.
So we're seeing quite a few invasive plants that are taking advantage of this gap in the forest and the extra sunlight that's seen here.
Yeah.
Are we seeing signs of tree regeneration on the floor here?
There are some. A lot of what you're seeing in the sort of shrub to seedling layer is the invasive stuff. But there's some tree seedlings here too. Here's a maple and an oak seedling. There's a few, but they're competing with all of these invasives, so they may or may not be able to thrive here. Now, what about the different age classes? This looks a lot different than the forest we were in before.
Yeah, this to me looks like it was probably abandoned from cultivation or some form of management at one time, and everything kind of grew up about the same age. All the trees are pretty much in the same age class for the most part.
Yeah.
Not a lot of diversity here in terms of ages of different trees.
Yeah. Now, what do we see in terms of lichens on the trees? I see a bunch here.
Yeah. And we would probably expect that the air quality here wouldn't be that different than the other site we were just at.
Exactly. And there might even be more here because we're in an area where there's a stream running through this little ravine. So more humidity would make a better environment for the lichens. But they can tolerate a lot of different conditions.
Sure. And in terms of wildlife, we've got a diversity of habitats here with the stream and the forest floor and the hillside beyond it. So I think we may see potential to see lots of different wildlife in these areas. We'd have to do some scouting to see what we could find.
Okay. Can you hear me, Julie?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep, we're good.
Okay, good.
So that completes our Forest Stewardship Workshop series. Remember, a link to these recordings will be available on our websites, and we'll be sending you the link for tonight's program in a few days. Before we take questions, we wanted to just thank the staff and board members of our respective organizations for giving us the opportunity to do these workshops. We thank the donors of the organizations who helped make it possible for us to do such projects, and in fact to offer them to folks for no charge. I do want to thank the Leslie Tumblety and Lori Quillen and Aaron Frick at Cary Institute who managed the registration and the outreach, and particularly Leslie, who took care to keep us online through all these evenings. So thank you so much. So let's go to questions, if there are any.
There are some. So the first one is asking Mike, where do we amateurs find that expertise to consult with or hire?
Again, I think there's a number of organizations out there that have expertise, and there are people who are willing to help if you ask. So I think the secret is to ask and see what kind of help you can get. The universities, the federal and state organizations, local cooperative extension, and many of these private not-for-profit organizations have people who can help if you ask specific questions. Of course, there are consulting foresters. Many times their interests may be more timber production related aspects, but if you let them know your goals and aspirations, they can tailor their recommendations to what you want to do. What would you say, Julie?
That sounds like a good start. I think, you know, we seem to have people from other counties besides Dutchess, so I would also suggest the Cornell Master Forest Owners Program, which I know we mentioned earlier, as a good place to start. So these are volunteers, folks who own forests and manage them. And you can, get in touch with the Master Forest Owners Program and arrange a site visit for someone to come out and have a look at your forest. So that's a good place to start. Those are folks that, live and work and manage land in your area. So they would be more plugged into the community of resources that would be available for that kind of thing.
There's a question about what resources, such as you showed, Julie, are available for other parts of the country. In particular, this person is asking about Litchfield, Connecticut. Unfortunately, I don't know what's available for that particular area, but I would go to your Soil and Water Conservation Office, your NRC office. There's one of those pretty much in every county in the country, and so they can at least get you started.
Yeah, I know the resources available for Dutchess and Columbia counties, which is where Dutchess Land Conservancy works. So Columbia County also has a web mapping utility it's a little newer, and I'm still kind of working out the kinks on that one, but it is available with a lot of the similar information to what Dutchess County has. But these are going to be very localized, so it's up to each county government to have their whatever their computer website department is come up with something. So I apologize that I don't really know much outside of my own operating area, which is Dutchess and Columbia counties, but certainly go to your county website and see what's there. And as Mike said, go to your local soil and water conservation district. They would also have a lot of maps. And, there are the sort of state level mappers, or at least regional mappers like the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper that the DEC has done. So that covers, the Hudson Valley, and they also have a state level mapper as well.
There's a comment that Dutchess County has a great website for parcel access, but the question was, is there similar resources for Tompkins County? And Tompkins happens to be the county where Cornell is located, and I believe they have similar, if not better, resources available there. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if you could find some very good online resources in that county as well.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, there's a question about, can I start by safely removing invasive species?
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that we've been careful to stress is the things that are impacting our forests and threatening their ability to regenerate are dominated by invasive species and deer. Those are the two main stressors on forests in our area. And so removing invasive species is a great start. I know in a previous session, we referred you to the Lower Hudson PRISM, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. If you're in a different part of the state, there are several different PRISMs throughout the state. They're a regional basis. The one that works in our area is the Lower Hudson PRISM. So I would refer you to whichever PRISM is in your area. Their websites have tons of information about identifying species, management recommendations, lots and lots of online resources for specific species, what's the best way to remove a small infestation, a large infestation. They do frequent webinars, so keep an eye on their events page on their websites. and they're just incredible sources of information. So absolutely refer you to the prisms for that type of information. And I think the major caution that I would have in terms of removing invasive species is to have a plan, just like my shop teacher always told us, because if you just go out and start yanking things out of the soil, remember what invasive species like best, which is disturbed soils. So before you start cutting, mowing, or pulling, or whatever management technique is recommended for your situation, make sure you have a plan so that you're not leaving bare disturbed soil, because what you'll get is another wave of invasive species. So do be cautious about planning ahead, thinking about what species you are going to work on, how you're going to do that, and how are you going to manage the land to keep the invasives from coming back.
And the Lower Hudson Prism and other prisms have a whole series of best management practices for each individual invasive plant. And so it's great to check them in terms of how to control them and what to look out for in terms of what could actually cause them to spread more. Julie, here's another question for you. Does Dutchess Land Conservancy work with realtors or realty associations so they can help educate prospective landowners about forest land?
We do to a certain extent, and that is something that I would love to do more of. So if you are a realtor or involved in a realty association, give me a call at the office and we can certainly talk about ways that we can reach out to prospective landowners. You know, we frequently do get calls at the office from someone who is looking to potentially purchase a property that's already protected by a conservation easement, or a property that they would like to purchase and protect themselves. And so in those cases, you know, I can arrange to go out in the field with that landowner and take a look at what they have. It's something we would definitely like to do more of. And one of the interesting side effects of the pandemic pushing us into all these webinars is that, you know, we've been doing a lot of these education programs, and now we have a library basically of recordings of these webinars. So we're hoping that those are another resource that we can use to refer people to when they have questions. You know, if you have a simple question, I'm sure you don't want to watch 6 hours worth of our webinars. But, you know, if for people who do want to learn a lot more and dig a lot deeper, you know, we're certainly developing a library on our website, on our YouTube page, of these types of webinars to provide this kind of education.
Julie, any recommendations for tick control, both on the land as well as personal?
Yes, and thank you for the question. It's really important that everyone is aware of the tick population here in Dutchess County and elsewhere. They are disease-carrying critters, and so you do need to be aware of them. As far as just sort of general advice is to wear light-colored clothing and tuck your pants into your socks when you go into especially brushy areas where there are likely to be a lot of ticks. There are some things you can do in terms of tick control, and the Cary Institute is in the middle of a long-term research project looking at different types of tick control. I don't know the current status of it. I know that they're looking at a spray application that can, I think it's a fungus, right, that attacks the ticks in situ and prevents them, it kills them basically. And another treatment is it's a bait box that draws in mice and chipmunks and small animals, and as they enter, there's a wick basically that brushes like an acaricide, a chemical on them that will kill the ticks. I don't remember the name of what they're using. Do you know that, Mike?
It's the same material that people put on their dogs for tick and flea control.
Right, which I'm totally blanking on the name, but I think you know what we mean, right? So there's research going on in terms of these two different methods of controlling ticks. And in general, and I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation, you know, somebody says, well, if I fence in my yard to keep out the deer, will that control the ticks? And I'll say, well, it might make a difference, but you still have to check yourself for ticks frequently when you're outside. And then they'll say, well, but if I spray my lawn, or if I trap all the mice, or if I do this, or if I do that, do I not have to check for ticks? And the answer is No, you always have to check for ticks. It doesn't matter what other measures you are taking. It doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing. You always have to check for ticks. It has become such a habit. Actually, my very first job out of college was working in the Lyme disease lab at the Cary Institute. So I was early on indoctrinated into the practice of checking frequently everywhere. So I might get some strange looks when I'm out in public going like this and trying to find the ticks on me, but just get in the habit. You have to be able to find the ticks on you and pull them off before they embed. Be really, really conscious of it. It's really important because they're so tiny. Most people can't feel them bite. You have to just get a visual and pull them off.
Also, using some kind of an insect repellent on your skin, like something that contains materials like DEET, can be helpful. And using a product on your clothes that contains permethrin can also be very helpful in terms of reducing the number of ticks that get by. Paying attention to your pets. You may be very careful, but if the dog or the cat come in and rub against you, you may find that even though you've checked, now you have a tick crawling on your pant leg. So it's kind of part of living in the country that we all pay attention to them, and it just becomes part of our daily process.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
There's an interesting question or comment about visiting their woodlots at different seasons, because they find seedlings in the beginning of the spring, but by the end of the summer, many of them have been eaten. And so they talk about different ways to fence in small sections of a woodlot to see if deer are consuming a lot of the seedlings that are there. And that's actually a research technique that's commonly used. And they talk about an assessment program that Cornell has developed, the Avid Assessing Vegetation Impacts for Deer program. And there's a link there. So that's also a good thing if you wanted to go see how some people are recommending you look at the impacts of deer on your forest. We at Cary have actually been assessing deer impacts on our forests since the 1970s. And we have a database of an annual spring browse survey where we look at how many forest species have been eaten by deer and what intensity the damage is. And we go out and each spring we'll count 4,000 or 5,000 buds and what percentage of them are consumed by deer during the winter. And the number of deer makes a difference, but other things also can make a difference in terms of whether there was a big acorn crop the previous year, whether we had a hard winter with lots of snow. And so a number of factors besides the number of deer can impact how many seedlings make it to sapling size and become part of the forest. But certainly there are ways to test that in your forest.
Great. Now we have a goat question. How do you feel about periodic goat grazing to control invasives in a woodland? And is this a common approach? I don't have a lot of specifics on this. I know that there are farms that have goat herds that they rent out for this exact thing. I know Bard College and Marist College have both hired the goats to do some invasives control on their land. Is that something that you know any more about, Mike? I'm kind of new at the whole goat approach.
Yeah, I think it can be effective. The difficult part is goats are they're not very picky, and so they will eat everything. And so you've really got to fence them into an area that's primarily invasive, and then you may have to do some planting afterwards to try and replace what's been eaten. But it has been an approach that has been used with some success.
And another question about planting new trees. So how do you manage planting new trees for canopy coverage if you have an area where watering is not possible?
Some of the things you can do is to change the timing of your planting. So if you plant a little earlier, maybe when the ground is first unfrozen, you can depend, at least in our area, on some spring rains to help the trees get established. Also, sometimes planting in the fall, if trees are available, can also be an effective way because we tend to get some fall rains as well. It's really that midsummer period where we get hot, dry conditions that can cause a high percentage of young seedlings to die. So working around that. There are things you can dip the roots of the trees in that kind of act like an absorbent material to increase their ability to hold water when they do have it. And that's a possibility as well. But I think I would look towards changing my planting time slightly.
Yeah, great advice. And here's a somewhat more technical question. How large a tree stand would start to be interesting for a consulting forester for timber production?
I think that really depends on the species of trees that are there and the age and their quality. I've seen foresters that were happy to work in a 5-acre block of high quality oak. So I don't know the exact number, but I think it's certainly worth asking them to come out and take a look. All they can say is, no, we're not interested.
And another kind of technical question, what is the best kind of management for invasive trees without using chemicals?
Again, management of invasives is typically species dependent. And so it's hard to say, do this or do that. Some mechanical means can actually increase their spread and cause more problems. So I would say go to a site that has best management practices and look up that specific invasive plant and see what they recommend for both chemical and non-chemical controls.
Okay, and a question on how to assess the age of trees. Is height the main method or other criteria? And this is really hard to do. Trees grow at different rates in different areas. It depends on the resource availability. If it's in a place where it's getting, adequate water through the soil, it's getting enough sunlight to photosynthesize and create the sugars that it needs to store, it can grow pretty fast. Some species naturally grow faster than other species. The ultimate way to determine the age of a tree is to take a core and to count the rings under a microscope. Most people don't have that ability. So it's a complicated question, and I just want to share an anecdote from one of the scientists at the Cary Institute who has cored a lot of trees in his time. And the oldest tree he found on the Cary Institute property was a chestnut oak that I think was about 6 or 7 inches in diameter, right, Mike?
Yeah.
And it was over 300 years old, I think. It was growing on a steep, rocky hillside where it just wasn't able to do a lot of photosynthesis, and it wasn't able to take in a lot of nutrients to grow. It probably had a hard time holding on in the first place, but it did hold on. And so even a pretty small tree can be pretty old, depending on the location of it. And you want to add anything to that?
Julie, probably one of the reasons it lived so long was because where it was located and no one wanted to bother to cut it down for firewood.
Yes, probably didn't have a lot of competition.
There's a comment about deer not transmitting the Lyme pathogen, and that is true. Typically, ticks become infected when they feed on a small host like a mouse or a chipmunk or a shrew. What deer do is help to spread around primarily the adult ticks, and that then means they decide where the eggs will be deposited and where the larval ticks will develop and come out. Any recommendations for garlic mustard removal?
Oh, I think, yeah, we talked about this last week. I looked it up on the PRISM website, and they do recommend pulling it out by the roots. You do have to be careful about disturbing the soil and, making sure that you're treating the area, planting something new so more invasives won't come in. But if you leave the taproot in place, it just resprouts, and that's the case with a lot of invasives.
And it looks like we've got one more question, and the question is, what do we mean by maintaining stability, integrity of a forest if the primary species is on the way out? Half of my forest is hemlock, but there's also beech, elm, and ash. So the forest will be very different when it does regenerate without them. And that's certainly true. It will be a different forest. The question is, will it be able to regenerate given deer and invasive species? And I think as stewards, the best we maybe can hope for is at least to start allowing those plants that are there the chance to regenerate.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up this question, because it does kind of show us just how much the world has changed since Aldo Leopold was writing back in the 1930s and 40s. The invasives weren't quite as much on his mind as they are now. And, and you're right that the stability and integrity of a forest, those are subjective terms. And so I think what I would encourage is just to think of the forest as a whole thing, more than just trees. It's all of the plants and animals and microorganisms that live there as well. And so maintaining the stability and integrity is, kind of thinking more of the food web as opposed to the trees as individuals. And so I think, Mike's case study of his forest losing all of those ash trees and now actively going in and planting species in there that he has, he's vetted the species. He knows which types of trees will grow in those drier uplands versus the lower wetlands, and monitoring them, remember where you plant them. So I think planting kind of has to be part of the solution, just because there's such a high mortality, especially from emerald ash borer. And this is certainly something we're hoping to do more work on, because it is a very common problem here in Dutchess County. Everybody's losing their ash trees right now. So I would just remind everybody, don't preemptively cut down your ash trees. You may have a lingering ash that can survive emerald ash borer and provide the genes to, keep the species with us in the future. Remember, about 1 out of 1,000 ash trees is resistant to the emerald ash borer. But, be proactive. Look at your soil type, look at what types of trees can grow in that area, and start planting. You might have to put little fences around them to keep the deer from eating them. You might even be able to fence an area of your forest, put like a plastic fencing, like snow fencing or something around, half an acre or something in your forest. And that will prevent the deer from eating those seedlings, allowing them to regenerate. And then once those seedlings have reached escape height, which is basically higher than the deer can eat, move your fence to another part of the forest. It's a very active management, though, and this is a really good example of why you can't just let nature take its course right here, right now. That's not something that's going to work, because there are just so many challenges that the forests are facing. So it's up to us to take an active role and be part of the forest community ourselves.
Well, Julie, we've reached the end of our time, and I think the end of our questions. So we hope this series has provided you with some new knowledge and understanding the role we can play as stewards. And we really appreciate the people who've joined us, the great questions that have pushed us to try and think about this topic and do a better job. So if you have ideas for further workshops you'd like to see, please send them to us. And I hope you'll keep coming back, and we'll try to keep providing good programming that helps.
Thank you all so much for sticking with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Bye now.
Bye.